Imagine a night so silent, it swallows the very air in the room. A darkness so thick that it seems to breathe, alive, waiting. In 1854, in a small, sleepy town in Rhode Island, something happened that no one dared write down, and fewer still would ever speak of aloud. It began with a child, a newborn, barely hours old, whose arrival should have been celebrated with lullabies and prayers. But what emerged in that room was anything but ordinary. The infant was unlike any other. His eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to see not just the room, but the threads of time itself. And then, as the night stretched on, an impossibility occurred. Teeth, small, sharp, fully formed teeth, erupted from his gums. Teeth that should not exist in the body of a child who had not yet even begun to cry filly. Within hours, the infant's mouth was a mirror of something unnatural, a symbol of something the human mind was never meant to comprehend. Whispers began to seep through the household. The midwife, a woman seasoned in decades of births, trembled in ways she had never known. The father, a stoic man of business and influence, found himself staring into a future that had suddenly shifted on its axis, a future that felt dark, predetermined, and terrifyingly deliberate. Even the neighbors, drawn by faint cries in the night, recoiled as though a shadow of something ancient and powerful had passed through the threshold. This was not merely a medical anomaly. It was a signal, a crack in the veil of reality where the hidden currents of history, of control, of power, began to bleed through. In that moment, it became clear that the child was not just a child. He was a harbinger, a living testament to forces that had shaped civilization in silence, forces that decided who would rise, who would fall, and who would be forgotten entirely. And here's the truth that no historian will tell you. This event, small as it may seem, is a key to understanding a shadow network of hidden agendas, of knowledge suppressed and buried beneath layers of lies. For those who dare to follow the trail, the infant's teeth are more than teeth. They are a warning, a code, a glimpse into the machinery that has governed humanity long before you were born. Tonight, you are going to see the story not as it was recorded, but as it truly happened, raw, unvarnished, and dangerous. If you listen closely, you may begin to hear the whispers of a hidden history that has shaped the world in silence. But beware, once you know, there is no returning. Once you see the teeth, you see the truth. By morning, the sun rose as it always had over Rhode Island, indifferent to what had changed beneath its light. The town awoke unaware that a line had been crossed in the night, that something ancient had stirred and left its mark behind in human flesh. The infant lay quiet now, wrapped tightly, as if cloth could restrain what had already announced itself. Those teeth were not imagination. They were touched, seen, confirmed, and then immediately hidden. In 1854, knowledge moved slower than fear, but fear traveled faster than truth. Words spread in fragments, unfinished sentences, widened eyes, doors shut mid-conversation. People did not ask what happened as much as they asked who had allowed it to happen. Because in societies governed by moral order and invisible hierarchies, anomalies are never accidents. They are blamed, assigned meaning, used. The local physician was summoned, a man trained in anatomy but loyal first to institutions, not truth. He examined the child for less than 5 minutes before his demeanor shifted. His hands grew rigid. His voice lowered. This was not concern. It was recognition. Not recognition of a medical condition, but of a pattern he had been warned about years earlier during his apprenticeship, in conversations that never appeared in textbooks. Sight and abnormalities, he'd been told, were not to be studied openly. They were to be reported. Because the 19th century was not merely an age of progress. It was an age of sorting, cataloging, deciding which bodies were acceptable vessels for society, and which were not. Beneath sermons and civic pride existed a silent doctrine: control the abnormal, suppress the inexplicable, and never let the public sense how fragile order truly is. The child's father was advised to keep the incident private. For the child's safety, they said. For the town's stability. For the sake of everyone. And like many men confronted with forces larger than themselves, he complied. But compliance does not erase awareness. It breeds guilt. And guilt becomes a leash. What most people don't understand is this: secrecy is not meant to protect truth. It is meant to isolate the witness. The moment the family agreed not to speak, they became participants in a system far older than New England itself, a system that feeds on silence. The infant's teeth were now officially unremarkable. The paperwork was adjusted. The records softened. Language became vague. Yet the fear did not leave, because the teeth continued to grow. And with them, behaviors that unsettled everyone who came close. The child did not cry when hungry. He stared. He followed movement with precision. And when he finally did cry, grown men stepped back, feeling something primitive rise in their chests, an instinct older than reason, whispering that this was not a victim of chance, but a product of design. You were never meant to know how often history repeats itself like this. One anomaly, one lie, one silence, and the machinery keeps turning. By the time the child was a week old, the household had already transformed into a cage of tension. Walls once familiar now felt like barriers against some unseen force, and every visitor, every servant, carried an unspoken question. What is this child really? The infant's teeth, glinting in candlelight, seemed to mock them, as if daring anyone to name the truth that no one dared speak. Sleep became a stranger to the family. The mother, haunted by instinctual terror, would wake in the middle of the night to find the child staring at her with an intensity that pierced the soul. The father, once a rational man grounded in commerce and law, found his mind teetering on the edge of obsession. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of shadows, felt like the child communicating in a language older than words, older than morality. The physician returned reluctantly, summoned by whispers that could no longer be contained. But what he observed only deepened the unease. The teeth were sharper. The child's gaze seemed to catalog everything around him with meticulous precision, as if measuring weaknesses, tracing patterns, recording secrets. There was no ordinary human development here. The child operated on a level that transcended age, transcended biology. Rumors, once confined to hushed corners, began circulating in the town, though they were never spoken outright. Parents whispered about children born wrong, about omens, about forces that selected victims and witnesses alike. Every time someone mentioned it, the words would falter, as if even language recognized the danger of the truth. The infant became a mirror, reflecting humanity's unspoken fears back to the world, and exposing the fragility of the structures people relied on to feel safe. And here's where it becomes more than just a story of an unusual birth. This child, in all his silent, tooth-studded power, was a test. A test not just for the family, but for society itself. Institutions that claimed to protect were already circling, deciding what could be ignored, what must be hidden, and what should be recorded under the guise of science or morality. Authority, as it often does, was quietly recalibrating, ensuring that no single anomaly could destabilize the illusion of control. Yet the deeper truth is far darker. The infant's arrival was not random. Behind it lay centuries of experimentation, breeding of influence, and manipulation that most would call legend or myth. Those who pull the strings of history, who decide what is written and what is buried, have always relied on children like him, vessels of potential, carriers of hidden truths, catalysts for transformation or destruction. The night deepened, and with it, the sense that this was only the beginning. Every heartbeat in that household, every whispered breath, became entwined with a force that would not be denied. The infant was awake, aware, and already beginning the slow, deliberate work of changing everything around him. And in that moment, the first lesson of hidden history becomes clear. The world is governed not by laws, but by the unseen, by what is concealed, by those who understand how to turn silence into power. Weeks passed, but the house remained a fortress of unease. Visitors ceased altogether. Even the most loyal servants found excuses to vanish. The child's presence warped the atmosphere, as if the walls themselves had learned to fear. Every creak, every flicker of candlelight carried meaning. The teeth were no longer merely a physical anomaly. They were a signal, a symbol of forces most could not name. Those who encountered him felt a tremor in the marrow, a primal warning that this was no ordinary human. The town, oblivious to the household's torment, continued its routines. Markets, churches, and town halls operated under the illusion that life remained predictable. But the ripple of forbidden knowledge had already begun. Whispers in private corners hinted at curses, unnatural births, and children touched by powers beyond comprehension. Every gossip contained an undertone of terror and awe. Those who spoke too openly found themselves shunned, labeled irrational, or quietly warned by unseen authorities to maintain silence. The machinery of control had already activated. Inside the home, the parents began to perceive patterns in the infant's behavior that defied logic. The child, barely moving on his own, seemed to anticipate events, a servant entering the room, a candle tilting in its holder, even the briefest flicker of thought from a nearby adult. His gaze held something older than memory, something that weighed and recorded every detail, shaping the family's perception of reality itself. Fear, curiosity, and/or collided, creating a psychological pressure so intense that the parents began questioning their own sanity. Meanwhile, the physician returned under the pretext of care, but his eyes told a different story. He observed the infant with a measured restraint, yet his hands shook when recording findings. In whispered notes meant to circulate only among the elite medical community, he described not just teeth, but a mind that appeared to operate outside time, that seemed to catalog and respond to stimuli before they even occurred. These reports, buried in dusty archives, were never published. They were intended only for those who already understood that knowledge itself is a weapon. Hey, in this hidden observation, we glimpse the true nature of power, the ability to decide which truths are recorded and which are buried. History, sanitized and curated, hides the instances that might awaken fear or inspire wonder in equal measure. The infant became a living testament to the silent structures of control, the invisible hierarchies that manage what society can and cannot confront. By now, the house had become a microcosm of forbidden knowledge. Every room contained an unspoken rule: speak too much, and you will be erased from the narrative. Witness too closely, and you may never forget. And the child remained patient. Teeth glinting in the candlelight, he was a quiet observer of the human frailties surrounding him, a master of anticipation, a symbol of the hidden currents that dictate life. This is the point where you, the observer, must understand. Knowledge is not neutral. To witness the truth is to be marked by it. Every secret carries a weight. Every anomaly, a door into the machinery of history itself. And some doors, once opened, do not close. It wasn't long before the town began to notice subtle shifts, though few could articulate what had changed. Mothers whispered of children waking in fear. Servants spoke of doors closing on their own, and merchants reported inexplicable cold drafts seeping through their shops. The infant had not left the house, yet the atmosphere of Rhode Island itself seemed to bend, as if reality was subtly rewiring around his presence. Some would later claim it was imagination. Others knew, instinctively, that something deeper had begun. By now, the child's teeth had hardened, each one glinting like a shard of knowledge carved into flesh. They were not merely teeth, they were symbols of awareness, tools of perception far beyond what a newborn could rationally achieve. Visitors were forbidden, yet the child required no interaction to exert influence. His gaze, when it met another's eyes, seemed to excavate hidden fears, unspoken desires, and the very vulnerabilities of the human mind. Adults, rational and experienced, would retreat before they even realized why. Authorities of the time, physicians, ministers, and town officials, began intervening under the guise of protection. In truth, their actions were driven by instinctual preservation. For institutions, the existence of such anomalies posed a threat far greater than disorder. They challenged the illusion of control. It is important to understand that the mechanisms of power are invisible. They operate silently, behind records, sermons, and polite society, ensuring that no anomaly disrupts the narrative. This child, unknowingly, had illuminated the cracks. And yet, the child did not act aggressively. There were no screams, no unnatural violence. His presence alone destabilized, revealed, and exposed the weaknesses of those around him. Fear, once silent, began to manifest. The family, isolated and watched, grew increasingly aware that they were pawns in a system far older than the town itself. Every decision, every glance, every step, was now part of a delicate balance between revelation and concealment. Hey, the first lesson of hidden power becomes clear. The true strength lies not in force, but in subtle control. Institutions, families, and even individuals who perceive anomalies often attempt containment. Silence becomes the tool. Complicity, the shield. Knowledge, a weapon both revered and feared. In the presence of the infant, these lessons unfolded daily. Every heartbeat in that house became a testament to the structures that govern reality beyond perception. By this point, the infant had already begun to shift the dynamics within the household. He observed, catalogued, and, without intent or malice, exposed the limits of human control. The parents, once confident in their understanding of life, were now haunted by a truth they could not name. They had become students in a curriculum older than memory itself, a curriculum of fear, secrecy, and the subtle assertion of unseen forces. And this is where you, watching now, must begin to see. History is not merely what is written in books. It is what is hidden in plain sight, what is whispered in corners, what is deliberately obscured to maintain control. The infant's teeth were the first visible crack, a symbol, a warning, and a challenge to anyone who dares to look closer. By the second month, the household had become a laboratory of observation, whether anyone wanted it or not. Every movement of the infant was catalogued, every gaze scrutinized. The teeth, now fully formed, glinted in candlelight like an omen. But the more the family watched, the more they realized that the child was not merely a passive anomaly. He was active, in ways subtle but undeniable. He manipulated perception without thought. He adjusted the rhythm of attention, the focus of the mind, even the emotional atmosphere of the room. Visitors were now entirely forbidden. Letters were censored. Any outsider who approached the house was subtly warned away, as if the town itself sensed the danger. And in truth, something had awakened, a force that extended beyond the home. The infant's presence drew attention from invisible observers, men and women connected to networks that spanned far beyond Rhode Island. These were the early architects of control, people who decided what knowledge could reach the public and what must remain hidden, shaping the collective understanding of reality itself. It is essential to grasp this. What the family experienced was not random. Their fear, their isolation, their complicity and secrecy, all of it had been anticipated. The child, in all his quiet power, had become the trigger for mechanisms that had existed long before him, mechanisms designed to contain anomalies, suppress disruptive truths, and preserve authority. Institutions were silent but omnipresent, operating like the cogs of a vast, invisible machine. Inside the house, the child's influence became more pronounced. His gaze would fix on an object or a person, and subtle changes would follow. A servant would forget a chore. A candle would tilt and drip wax in precise patterns. A conversation would falter, leaving a pregnant pause, as if the room itself had conspired to withhold information. These were not accidents. They were demonstrations of awareness, proof that the infant operated on a level far beyond instinct or simple perception. The parents began to realize that the infant was teaching them something they had never learned in school, in religion, or in polite society. The world is not governed by randomness or morality alone. It is governed by hidden currents, structures that enforce control quietly, invisibly, and without apology. Those who can perceive these currents gain insight. Those who cannot are guided unknowingly, like leaves on a river. And here's the dangerous truth. Once you see the mechanisms at work, you cannot unsee them. Once you understand how easily humans are manipulated, how fear is weaponized, and how secrecy preserves power, you are no longer the same. The infant, unknowingly, had become the catalyst. He exposed not only the fragility of his household but also the structures that shaped the entire society around him. Now, as you follow this descent, understand that this is not merely a story of a child with teeth. This is a story of observation, influence, and the machinery of control. Every detail matters. Every pause, every look, every suppressed word is part of a system designed to shape perception and behavior. And once you recognize it, you enter a world that most will never see, and even fewer will survive psychologically intact. By the third month, the whispers had begun to seep beyond the household. Townspeople who had glimpsed the infant, or even heard of his strange emergence, spoke in hushed tones. There were rumors of a child born with teeth, of a gaze that could unnerve the most confident adult, of a presence that warped perception. But those who spoke too loudly were met with subtle, coercive interventions. A neighbor suddenly fell ill, a minor accident occurred, a letter went missing. Fear, as always, was the invisible hand guiding compliance. Local authorities, alerted by these murmurs, approached with caution. They did not arrive as seekers of knowledge, they came as enforcers of order. In 1854, the concept of anomaly was tightly controlled. Deviations from normalcy were either sanitized, hidden, or eradicated entirely. When the infant was presented to the physician assigned by the town, the man was meticulous, precise, and restrained. His notebook, later hidden from public archives, recorded not merely observation, but strategy. How to contain the anomaly without creating panic. How to neutralize curiosity without evidence. The infant, however, did not submit to scrutiny in conventional ways. His teeth, now fully sharp and gleaming, were not his only anomaly. His behavior suggested comprehension and manipulation of human expectation. When questioned, he would stare, unblinking, as if assessing the observer's intent. Adults, trained in logic and reason, found themselves paralyzed. Decisions that seemed simple, how to feed him, how to bathe him, even how to measure his growth, became exercises in anxiety. The child, with no words and only his silent presence, held power over perception itself. This was the first lesson in institutional control intersecting with hidden knowledge. The anomaly does not need to act overtly to disrupt. Its mere existence challenges authority, exposes vulnerability, and forces adaptation. The infant became a living experiment in fear management, psychological influence, and the suppression of truth. Those tasked with oversight learned quickly that overt confrontation risked destabilizing not only the household, but the town's carefully curated order. And so, containment became subtle. Walls were reinforced not physically, but socially. Gossip was discouraged, curiosity was redirected, and silence was mandated through both overt and covert means. Fear was weaponized silently. Every adult in contact with the child became an unwitting participant in a broader strategy, preserving the illusion of normalcy while controlling the anomalous. Yet the child's teeth remained, a visible reminder of what could not be contained. Every gleam in candlelight was a punctuation of defiance, a symbol that life does not always conform to human expectation. And for those willing to see, those willing to acknowledge the hidden forces at work, a new reality emerged. The structures that govern society are fragile. Control is an illusion, maintained not by transparency or morality, but by secrecy, fear, and subtle psychological manipulation. This is where you, the observer, begin to confront the uncomfortable truth. History is not written by chance. It is curated, edited, and engineered. Anomalies like this child are the cracks in the narrative. They expose how power is maintained, how minds are influenced, and how fear shapes obedience. And once you recognize these patterns, you are no longer outside the machinery. You are inside it, and the gears begin to turn around you. By the 4th month, the household had transformed into a chamber of constant tension. Every gesture, every word, every glance carried weight, as if the infant's presence had rewritten the rules of perception itself. The parents began noticing patterns in behavior that could not be explained by coincidence. Servants would forget tasks only when the child's gaze fell upon them. Candles would extinguish without cause, always near objects the infant seemed drawn to. Even the adults themselves found their thoughts disrupted, ideas slipping away mid-formation, as though the house had become an instrument tuned to the child's awareness. The teeth, sharp and glimmering, were now more than a physical anomaly. They had become a symbol, a tangible marker of the child's unseen influence. Those who encountered him could not help but feel it. A silent command, a subtle rearrangement of attention and emotion. Fear, curiosity, and awe intertwined, creating a psychological pressure that could crush the unprepared mind. This was not merely observation, it was manipulation, passive but absolute. The mother, once confident in her maternal instincts, began doubting her own perceptions. She could sense when the child's gaze had shifted, even when he lay in shadow. Patterns emerged in the smallest details. The way dust settled on the floor, the irregular beat of a nearby clock, the rhythm of servants' movements. Each anomaly reinforced a deeper truth she could not articulate. The child was not just a newborn. He was a catalyst, a node of influence that revealed the fragility of human control. The father, too, recognized the patterns, though he attempted to mask his awareness. A man of logic and commerce, he had never confronted forces beyond reason. But logic failed. The infant's presence demonstrated that influence could exist without intent, that power could operate invisibly, shaping perception and behavior. Every decision in the household, every act of compliance or concealment, was now part of a larger, unspoken system, an early exercise in what centuries later would be called psychological conditioning. Outside the house, the town remained largely oblivious, but subtle forces began to ripple outward. The physician, acting as both observer and enforcer, adjusted his reports carefully, documenting anomalies in language so coded that only the initiated could understand. Authority, even in the 1850s, relied on such coded management, controlling what could be spoken, observed, or believed. The child's presence forced them to engage these mechanisms directly. This is the critical point. The infant's existence revealed a truth about power itself. Influence does not require violence. Control does not demand visibility. Fear and obedience can be cultivated silently, through presence alone, through the subtle manipulation of perception, through isolation, and through the careful management of narrative. The infant's teeth, his gaze, his very being, became instruments of that invisible power, teaching lessons that would echo through generations, long after the town had forgotten his name. And for you, the observer, the lesson is chilling. History is not a series of random events. It is a carefully maintained choreography. Anomalies are not mistakes. They are tests, triggers, and mirrors, reflecting the fragile scaffolding that underpins human society. And once you begin to see it, you cannot unsee it. By the 5th month, whispers from beyond the household had grown louder, though they were still shrouded in half-truths and fey. A traveling physician, curious and ambitious, attempted to gain access under the pretense of study. Letters of introduction, polite requests, and veiled promises of secrecy were presented. But the infant's presence, silent, patient, observant, made the man hesitate the moment he crossed the threshold. The air itself seemed heavier, as if the house exhaled caution. His logical mind recoiled against the inexplicable, yet instinct whispered that he had entered a space governed by rules far older than reason. Inside, the household was acutely aware of the intrusion. The child's gaze, unblinking and precise, followed every movement. The teeth, now glimmering like ritualistic symbols, reflected candlelight onto the walls, casting shadows that seemed alive. Servants froze mid-step. The mother felt her chest tighten, every breath synchronized with the infant's silent rhythm. The father, though experienced in business and negotiation, experienced an unfamiliar paralysis, an instinctive understanding that some presences are not to be challenged. The visitor attempted a superficial examination, taking notes, palpating, questioning. Yet every action was subtly disrupted. A page of notes vanished, a candle tipped over. A fleeting sound distracted attention at exactly the critical moment. It was as though the infant understood intention before it materialized, orchestrating small interruptions with precision that defied chance. The physician recorded only what he could rationalize, omitting the strange, the impossible, and the clearly unnatural. History, as always, would preserve only the sanitized version. This encounter revealed a core principle of hidden influence. Anomalies do not need words to dominate. Observation alone creates power. Those who attempt to engage without understanding are manipulated by circumstance itself. Every thought the visitor formed, every step he took, was subtly guided by forces beyond comprehension. The infant was not acting with malice. He was, in essence, an instrument through which unseen mechanisms of control demonstrated their reach. Outside the walls, the town remained unaware, yet subtle patterns shifted. Tradesmen altered their routes. Gossip hesitated. Fey, transmitted socially, began to ripple like a current through the population. The child's influence was not confined to sight. It radiated, infecting thought and expectation, bending behavior long before anyone could recognize it. This is how control operates in hidden systems. It is quiet, pervasive, and self-reinforcing. And here is the uncomfortable truth. What appears to be normal life is constantly shaped by unseen forces. Patterns of fear, manipulation, and suppression extend far beyond what is recorded in history. The infant, with teeth and gaze, had become a living demonstration of the machinery at work, a mirror showing the fragility of human perception, the subtle orchestration of obedience, and the unspoken rules that govern the world without ever needing to declare themselves. By the 6th month, it became evident that the infant's awareness exceeded what anyone could rationally explain. He was no longer simply reactive. He was anticipatory. Small events unfolded in perfect sequence around him, as if the room itself were an extension of his perception. Candles flickered in tandem with thought, objects shifted subtly, and even the family's emotions seemed to ebb and flow according to his silent rhythms. His teeth, now fully formed and gleaming, were markers, not just of anomaly, but of intelligence beyond comprehension. The parents, once confident in their understanding of life and human behavior, were now students of something older and darker. They watched patterns emerge, tracing influence that had no visible source. Servants forgot chores at precise moments. Arguments dissolved inexplicably. Objects moved, always in alignment with some hidden logic they could not name. Every detail of daily life had become a lesson in the quiet assertion of power. Outside the household, town authorities maintained a careful distance, their reports sanitized, coded, and stored in private archives. The infant's presence was already reshaping perception, creating a controlled fear without overt intervention. This is how power operates silently, by altering what people expect, by directing attention, and by creating the illusion of causality. Observation alone becomes a mechanism of control, and the child embodied it naturally. It was during these months that the family began to notice another unsettling pattern. The infant seemed to understand hierarchy intuitively. He responded differently to each observer, calibrating his attention, gaze, and even demeanor according to perceived authority. This implied comprehension of social structures far beyond what any newborn could acquire. The implication was terrifying. The child was not simply anomalous in body, but in mind, a preternatural agent capable of influencing adults, institutions, and the very social fabric of the town without uttering a word. This is a critical revelation for anyone willing to see the deeper currents of history. Influence is not always exercised through action. It can be subtle, invisible, anticipatory. It is embedded in presence, perception, and timing. The infant's existence became a live demonstration of this principle, showing how fear, respect, and obedience could be elicited without authority, without coercion, simply through unspoken awareness. By this point, the parents understood the stakes. The child was no longer a secret merely to be concealed. He was a mirror of unseen structures, a proof that the world is governed not by reason alone, but by systems that operate beneath perception. Every day in the house became a test of understanding. Could they navigate the currents of control without being swept away, or would they succumb to the invisible forces now entwined with every breath, every heartbeat, and every glance? For the viewer listening now, this is where the descent deepens. The child is no longer simply a story. He is a warning, an illustration of the machinery that shapes society silently. And once you recognize these patterns, you begin to perceive the fragile scaffolding that underlies all human systems, a scaffolding so delicate that anomalies, like this infant, can reveal its hidden architecture, forever changing the way you see the world. By the 7th month, it became clear that the infant's anomaly could not remain hidden forever. Though the town's records were sanitized, whispers had traveled, carried on cautious tongues. And among those whispers, there were ears trained to detect disruption, individuals and networks whose purpose was not merely observation, but preservation of control. These were the early architects of what centuries later would be understood as elite systems of surveillance, influence, and containment. Letters arrived at the household, unsigned but unmistakably formal, suggesting interest, oversight, and the need for discretion. The family understood the implicit threat. Curiosity was permitted only under conditions dictated by those with knowledge far older and more powerful than any local authority. They had entered a web far larger than Rhode Island itself, a network that thrived on secrecy, compliance, and the silent orchestration of events. Within the home, the child's presence continued to shift the behavior of everyone around him. The teeth, now unmistakably sharp, reflected not just light but a symbolic awareness. They were markers of his influence, tangible reminders that power does not always speak, it manifests. Servants hesitated before acting. Adults double-checked themselves constantly, and the family began to realize that the infant's awareness seemed to extend beyond the walls, anticipating events, sensing intent, and responding to stimuli no one else could perceive. The mother, already unnerved, began recording observations in secret. She noted patterns, timing, reactions, and subtle environmental shifts. It became evident that the child's behavior followed a logic beyond instinct, almost like an early, natural experiment in psychological influence. The infant was learning, testing, and shaping human behavior around him, quietly, precisely, irrevocably. Meanwhile, the father, who had initially hoped to preserve normalcy through compliance, now recognized the impossibility of the task. Every choice carried weight. Every action, or inaction, was observed, measured, and responded to by a presence he could not control. And beyond the household, the unseen networks were doing the same, ensuring that all anomalies were funneled into channels of suppression, secrecy, and strategic manipulation. This is a critical truth. Systems of control are not reactive. They are anticipatory. They use fear, isolation, and the subtle orchestration of perception to maintain dominance. The infant, without malice or intent, had become both the subject and demonstration of this principle. His very existence exposed the fragility of societal structures and illuminated how elites, hidden in plain sight, maintain control over knowledge, fear, and obedience. For you listening now, this is a turning point. The story is no longer simply about a child with teeth. It is a lesson in power, influence, and the invisible forces that govern human behavior. Those who understand these mechanisms recognize that history is not random. It is curated, controlled, and shaped by systems designed to hide the extraordinary in plain sight. By the 8th month, the family realized they were no longer the sole observers in the house. Unseen eyes, communicated through letters, discreet visitors, and coded instructions, began influencing decisions, guiding actions, and shaping the environment. The infant had become a focal point for experiments in control and perception, a living subject in a network of invisible observation that few could even conceptualize. The teeth, fully formed and unnervingly sharp, glinted like markers of insight into forces most adults refused to acknowledge. The parents, once merely anxious, were now acutely aware of the invisible pressure surrounding every choice. Even mundane actions, a servant's movement, a meal prepared, a chair moved, became carefully monitored events. The child's gaze, silent and unblinking, seemed to understand intention before it was expressed. Objects subtly shifted around him, incidents occurred with precise timing, and the environment itself bent to the rhythm of his awareness. It was as if the house had become a living laboratory, orchestrated by both the infant and the unseen networks observing him. Letters from the outside instructed the family to maintain strict records, to conceal anomalies, and to control the narrative. These were not suggestions, they were imperatives. They made clear, if subtly, that failure to comply would bring consequences. And the infant, though silent, absorbed it all. He reacted to changes in behavior, intention, in fear, adjusting his presence to test, to measure, to learn. He became both subject and teacher, demonstrating the principles of control without uttering a word. The mother began to notice subtle psychological shifts in herself and those around her. Fear became anticipation. Anxiety became obedience. Curiosity became silence. She recorded these changes with trembling hands, realizing that what was unfolding was not merely a domestic challenge, but a demonstration of the mechanics of influence, how subtle observation, expectation, and fear could direct human behavior with precision. Meanwhile, the father, a man of reason and business, began to confront a terrifying realization. Logic and authority offered no protection here. The infant's anomalies, the teeth, the gaze, the quiet orchestration of perception, all combined to expose the fragility of human control. And the larger networks, the unseen architects of suppression and observation, ensured that this fragility was documented, measured, and leveraged, silently shaping knowledge, fear, and history itself. This is the point where you, listening, must confront the unsettling truth. Power does not require violence to be absolute. It can operate invisibly, shaping perception, controlling narrative, and orchestrating behavior without declaration or display. The infant's presence, his anomalies, and the silent observation surrounding him illustrate how subtle mechanisms, anticipation, influence, concealment, govern society. Once you recognize this, you begin to see the hidden scaffolding that underlies not only history, but human interaction itself. By the 9th month, the household had become a crucible of tension, observation, and silent control. Every movement, every glance, every thought seemed to bend under the weight of the infant's presence. The teeth, now fully visible and unnervingly precise, were more than a physical anomaly. They were markers of an unseen intelligence, a reminder that influence could exist without action, that power could manifest without intent. The mother found herself watching not just the child, but the servants, the walls, even the air itself. Subtle shifts in temperature, light, and sound became signals, cues, lessons in behavior she could neither control nor predict. Anxiety, once sporadic, had transformed into a constant state of hyper-awareness. She noticed that the child's gaze, unblinking and piercing, seemed to track not only her actions, but her thoughts, her unspoken intentions. Every hesitation, every unguarded emotion was catalogued, measured, and responded to in real time. The father, once a man grounded in rationality and commerce, began to understand the fragility of human authority. He realized that knowledge alone could not counteract influence when perception itself was manipulated. The child's presence, the subtle environmental shifts, and the anticipation of actions created a feedback loop that distorted reality for anyone within the household. This was not fear imposed externally. It was fear induced through observation, anticipation, and subtle orchestration. Outside observers, the unseen networks of influence, continued their covert interventions. Letters, directives, and visits, carefully coded, ensured compliance and the preservation of secrecy. The infant became both subject and agent in a system that measured human response, manipulated attention, and reinforced obedience without violence or coercion. His anomalies were not merely studied, they were instrumental, proving how subtle forces could govern behavior with precision. Here is the essential truth: the mechanisms of control are pervasive, anticipatory, and invisible. Power does not announce itself. It operates quietly, subtly bending human perception and shaping outcomes without declaration. The infant, with teeth and gaze, became a living demonstration of these principles. Those in his presence were reshaped, consciously or not, by the very act of observation and anticipation. And for you, the observer, this is where awareness begins to fracture. Once you recognize that reality can be guided by unseen forces, once you see how fear, anticipation, and subtle influence govern behavior, your understanding of society, history, and human interaction is forever altered. The infant's anomaly is no longer just a story. It is a lesson, a warning, and a mirror showing the hidden scaffolding of control that most will never perceive. By the 10th month, the effects of the infant's presence began to seep beyond the walls of the household. The town, previously untouched by the anomaly, now experienced subtle disturbances, small, almost imperceptible shifts in perception, behavior, and expectation. Merchants hesitated mid-transaction. Children avoided certain streets for no reason they could explain. Conversations faltered in mid-sentence. The unseen influence radiated outward like a current, bending thought and emotion without leaving a trace. The teeth, now unmistakable and sharp, were a constant reminder that this child defied the natural order. But it was not the teeth alone that unsettled people. It was the awareness behind them. Those who glimpsed the infant, or even heard of his strange anomalies, reported unease that could not be rationalized. Their instincts screamed danger even as their minds struggled to reject it. In this way, influence had become both silent and absolute. Outside observers, those connected to hidden networks of authority, took note. The infant's anomaly was no longer simply a curiosity. It was a variable to be studied, contained, and, if necessary, controlled. Letters arrived instructing the family to maintain secrecy, to prevent public awareness, and to document responses carefully. These directives were subtle, coded, and unmistakably authoritative. The child was already part of a system that measured not only anomalies, but human reaction to them, an early example of psychological manipulation executed without confrontation. Inside the home, the family's behavior continued to shift under pressure. Fear became anticipation, anticipation became strategy, and strategy became silent obedience to forces they could neither name nor resist. The infant's gaze, unblinking and precise, seemed to measure, categorize, and respond to each subtle adjustment in behavior. Every decision the family made, from feeding the child to interacting with outsiders, was influenced by his presence, whether consciously or unconsciously. This is the first true lesson in the architecture of hidden power. Influence is often invisible. It does not rely on force, punishment, or command. It relies on observation, anticipation, and subtle manipulation. It operates through perception itself, bending the thoughts, fears, and decisions of those within its sphere. The infant, with his teeth and silent awareness, was not simply anomalous. He was a live demonstration of these principles, a mirror, revealing the mechanisms of control that underlie human society. For you watching, the implications are clear and dangerous. The world is not as it seems. Fear, obedience, and compliance are cultivated quietly, invisibly, through the subtle orchestration of perception and expectation. Once you perceive these currents, you cannot unsee them. Once you understand the machinery at work, your understanding of history, society, and human interaction is permanently altered. By the 11th month, the town could no longer ignore the undercurrents of fear radiating from the household. Neighbors whispered of strange happenings, doors left ajar that should have been closed, sudden chills in the air, and an unshakable sense of being watched. Children avoided the street near the house, as though instinct itself warned them against approaching. Yet, when questioned, no one could articulate why. Fear had become invisible, operating not through confrontation but through subtle suggestion, anticipation, and observation. Local authorities, compelled by duty and social pressure, decided to investigate. But even they approached with caution, aware that this was no ordinary case. The infant, now nearly a year old, did not need to speak to exert influence. His gaze alone unsettled the strongest man, and his teeth, glinting unnaturally, acted as constant reminders that this child defied natural order. Every subtle movement, an unblinking stare, a slight tilt of the head, reshaped the expectations, fears, and decisions of those around him. When the officials entered the household, they found themselves subtly manipulated. Candles flickered at precise moments, shadows shifted, and conversations faltered without explanation. Decisions they believed to be deliberate were quietly redirected by forces they could not perceive. The infant's presence created a ripple of anticipation, bending behavior, attention, and even thought. The teeth were not just anomalies, they were symbols of influence, markers of intelligence and awareness that instilled unease in anyone who dared observe closely. The family, already conditioned by months of observation and external pressure, had become both participants and witnesses in a larger system of control. Fear and obedience were no longer optional. They were structural. Every choice, how to answer questions, how to react to visitors, how to maintain secrecy, was shaped by forces that extended beyond the house. The infant had become a nexus, a silent agent through which invisible networks exercised influence over both the household and the town. This is the core lesson. Power operates quietly. It does not need violence or proclamation. It manifests in observation, anticipation, and subtle orchestration. The infant demonstrated this principle effortlessly. Those around him, family, officials, even neighbors, were reshaped by his presence, proving how easily behavior and perception can be guided without coercion. For the observer, the implication is stark. History is not merely written events. It is curated, manipulated, and controlled by unseen forces that operate through fear, expectation, and influence. The infant's anomaly, the teeth, and his silent awareness are not just curiosities, they are a live demonstration of how control is exercised, how obedience is cultivated, and how perception itself can be orchestrated. By the 12th month, the effects of the infant's presence had fully infiltrated the social fabric of the town. What began as subtle unease had become a pervasive tension, invisible yet undeniable. Neighbors unconsciously avoided the household. Conversations stalled near the vicinity. Children recoiled from streets they had once traversed freely. The influence was silent, operating without overt coercion, yet every interaction carried the weight of anticipation. People were reshaped by fear before they even understood its source. Inside the home, the child's teeth gleamed like deliberate markers, a constant reminder of the anomaly that defied natural order. His gaze, unblinking and penetrating, continued to calibrate the room, measuring intent, expectation, and emotional state with uncanny precision. The servants, the parents, even visiting officials, everyone adjusted their behavior in response, consciously or not. Patterns emerged, delayed reactions, hesitations, silent compliance. The infant did not act aggressively, yet his presence alone manipulated perception and decision-making, demonstrating the raw mechanics of influence. The family, now living under constant observation both from the infant and from the external networks monitoring him, began to internalize the lessons of anticipation and control. Fear was no longer an external emotion. It had become embedded in thought, behavior, and even perception itself. The parents realized that the child was teaching them a curriculum older than memory, the subtle art of power, the orchestration of behavior, and the manipulation of perception without a single word. Outside the household, the ripple effects became social. Community interactions were subtly altered, patterns of conversation and movement shifted unconsciously. Authority figures exercised caution, ensuring that curiosity did not escalate into disclosure. Fear had become structural, silent yet pervasive, shaping the town in alignment with unseen, deliberate forces. The infant's anomaly had become both catalyst and instrument, a living node within a larger system of control, illustrating the fragility of human structures when confronted with something truly outside expectation. This moment crystallizes a dangerous truth. Influence does not require overt power. Observation, anticipation, and subtle manipulation can redirect human behavior completely, leaving the impression of free choice while the underlying structure is entirely orchestrated. The infant, without intention or communication, was demonstrating the principle of invisible authority. For you listening, this is where the descent becomes unavoidable. What you perceive as normal society is built upon these hidden currents. Fear, compliance, and behavior are constantly curated by forces that remain unseen. The teeth, the gaze, the presence of this infant, these are not merely anomalies, they are windows into the architecture of control, showing how perception and obedience are silently enforced. Once this is understood, the world as you know it begins to fracture. By the 13th month, it became evident that the infant was no longer passive. His awareness extended beyond mere observation. It began to test the household, subtly shaping reactions and behavior. Objects were displaced in patterns that seemed deliberate. Servants hesitated at precise moments. Even the parents found themselves second-guessing their instincts, their decisions bending under the silent influence of his gaze. The teeth, sharp and reflective, acted almost as instruments of perception, signaling presence, attention, and latent power. These tests were never overt. No one was threatened, no one harmed. Yet every event carried a lesson. Anticipation, compliance, and subtle obedience could be measured, cultivated, and refined without overt coercion. The infant demonstrated that power does not require force. It requires awareness, presence, and the ability to manipulate expectation. Every delay, every hesitation, every small misstep in the household became data for the unseen intelligence residing in that small body. The parents, initially protective and fearful, began to realize the breadth of what they were witnessing. This was more than an anomaly. It was a live demonstration of influence, a curriculum in human behavior delivered without words. Even outside observers, those connected to hidden networks of authority, noted the subtle orchestration, recording patterns and reactions with clinical precision. The infant had become a nexus for the study of perception, control, and fear, a living experiment in the mechanics of obedience. Meanwhile, the town, oblivious to the direct mechanics, experienced ripples of influence. Decisions were delayed, behavior subtly altered, and social interactions adjusted in unconscious alignment with the currents radiating from the household. Fear, anticipation, and respect were cultivated silently, a process entirely invisible to those who believed they were acting independently. This is the quiet architecture of control, operating through observation and expectation rather than authority or violence. Here lies the dangerous lesson for the observer. The world is structured not only by rules and laws, but by invisible forces that manipulate thought, behavior, and perception. Influence can be quiet, subtle, and pervasive, operating through presence alone. The infant, with teeth and awareness far beyond comprehension, became a living symbol of this principle. Those who encountered him, knowingly or not, were already participants in a system that measured, influenced, and shaped human response. And now, as you witness this descent, you must confront a truth few can endure. Anomalies reveal hidden mechanisms. They expose the scaffolding of control and the subtle orchestration of obedience. Once you perceive this, your understanding of society, history, and human behavior is forever altered. You are now aware that fear, influence, and compliance are often engineered silently, invisibly, and relentlessly. By the 14th month, the infant's influence had begun to extend beyond the household in ways that no one could fully measure. Fear, once localized, now radiated outward, affecting social interactions across the town. Neighbors unconsciously adjusted their routines. Conversations ended abruptly near the house. Even merchants altered routes to avoid unexplained chills in the air. The teeth, sharp and reflective, became more than an anomaly. They were the outward symbol of a presence that could bend human behavior without a single word. Inside the home, the child continued to test perception and anticipation. Servants hesitated, parents double-checked decisions, and minor disturbances, fallen objects, flickering candles, whispered sounds, were orchestrated with uncanny timing. It was as if the infant could manipulate not only the immediate environment but also the reactions of those who entered it. These were subtle demonstrations of control, experiments in fear, obedience, and the psychology of anticipation. Observation alone had become a tool of influence. The family, now seasoned by months of silent instruction, began to recognize patterns that defied natural explanation. The child's gaze, precise and unblinking, could disrupt thought mid-process. Every glance measured intent, every tilt of the head redirected focus. The parents realized that influence could operate invisibly, that perception itself could be shaped, and that fear could be weaponized without violence. The infant, without malice or speech, had become an agent of silent authority, demonstrating how human behavior could be orchestrated from a position of subtle awareness. Outside observers, part of the hidden networks monitoring anomalies, noted these effects carefully. Reports, coded and deliberately vague to maintain secrecy, documented reactions, timing, and emotional shifts. The child's anomaly was not merely a curiosity. It was a living experiment in influence, control, and the subtle governance of behavior. Every action, every hesitation, every ripple of fear was catalogued, revealing the mechanics of authority in a society that believed itself free. This is where the lesson crystallizes. Power rarely manifests as force. It operates invisibly, through anticipation, observation, and subtle psychological pressure. The infant's presence exposed the fragility of social systems, the malleability of human behavior, and the quiet orchestration of obedience. Those who perceived it, consciously or unconsciously, were already participants in a controlled experiment, a demonstration of principles that most would never recognize. For you listening, this is the dangerous threshold. History, society, and human behavior are not as autonomous as they appear. Fear, control, and compliance can be quietly cultivated, invisibly enforced, and subtly manipulated. The teeth, the gaze, the silent awareness of this infant, these are not curiosities. They are keys to understanding the hidden scaffolding of power, and once you see them, you can never return to ignorance. By the 15th month, the infant's household had become a focal point for observation by external parties, agents of hidden networks who understood that anomalies like this could not be left uncontrolled. Letters arrived with coded instructions, subtle pressures, and implicit threats. Visitors, some of them physicians, some administrators, others unknown, were sent under the guise of curiosity, yet their true mission was far darker: to test, to provoke, and to document the infant's influence over perception and behavior. Inside the house, the child's presence continued to operate with uncanny precision. Servants hesitated in their duties, conversations faltered mid-sentence, and objects shifted as if guided by intention. The teeth, glinting in candlelight, served as reminders that this was no ordinary infant. His gaze measured intent and recalibrated responses in real time. Every subtle disturbance was absorbed and reflected, teaching the family, and those who observed, the mechanics of influence without a single word being spoken. These external agents, however, were not immune to the forces at play. Their carefully constructed plans, their attempts to test limits, were quietly manipulated. Candles would flicker at critical moments, notes would vanish, and subtle distractions would derail observation. It became increasingly clear that the infant's awareness extended beyond instinct. He operated on a level that anticipated strategy, perception, and intention, a silent mastery of influence that unnerved even the most experienced adults. The parents, forced into roles of both protection and participant, observed these interactions with growing unease. They began to realize that their child was not merely anomalous. He was a living instrument revealing the architecture of control. Every hesitation, every unspoken fear, and every act of obedience reflected principles of psychological influence, demonstrating that behavior could be shaped without coercion and compliance could be elicited without threat. Outside, the town continued to experience subtle ripples. Social patterns shifted unconsciously. Fear, anticipation, and respect was silently transmitted, and the presence of unseen networks ensured that knowledge of the anomaly remained contained. This was systemic control in action, subtle, pervasive, invisible. The infant was both the subject and the agent, demonstrating how elite structures maintain power not through force, but through anticipation, observation, and the silent orchestration of behavior. For you watching now, this is the pivotal lesson. Influence does not always announce itself. It operates quietly, invisibly, shaping perception, manipulating expectation, and conditioning obedience. The teeth, the gaze, the presence of this infant, these are not curiosities. They are evidence of how power functions beneath the surface of human experience. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. History, society, and human behavior are fragile, and anomalies like this illuminate the hidden scaffolding that sustains control. By the 16th month, the parents began to recognize a chilling truth. Their child's influence was no longer confined to individuals. It extended into the collective consciousness of the town. Subtle shifts in behavior, unspoken fear, and the invisible anticipation of consequences had begun to alter the social fabric. Streets once bustling with children now felt empty. Conversations stalled before they began. Patterns of avoidance emerged, not directed by law or ordinance, but by an instinctive, unspoken alignment with the infant's presence. The teeth, sharp and gleaming, were now symbols not only of anomaly but of authority without intent. They reflected a consciousness that could disrupt, guide, and manipulate perception effortlessly. The gaze, unblinking and precise, had become a tool of subtle orchestration, demonstrating that influence could operate entirely without force. Parents, servants, and visitors alike found themselves reshaping actions, speech, and even thoughts to accommodate the unseen, anticipatory intelligence embodied in that small body. It became increasingly clear that this was more than a household anomaly. It was a demonstration of systemic influence. Fear, anticipation, and compliance could be cultivated without overt coercion. External networks observing the child documented these effects meticulously, understanding that human behavior could be subtly molded through presence, timing, and perception. The infant had become both the subject and instrument of highly social experimentation, revealing principles of control that would be repeated across centuries in every institution that seeks obedience without resistance. Inside the household, tension and awareness reached new levels. Every glance, every hesitation, every flicker of movement was analyzed, absorbed, and responded to. The parents realized that their child's silent orchestration had recalibrated their own cognition. They no longer acted freely. Their thoughts, decisions, and reactions were shaped by anticipatory awareness. The infant's anomaly became a lens through which the mechanics of control, both subtle and systemic, were made tangible. This is the dangerous lesson. Influence often operates invisibly, through anticipation, observation, and the manipulation of expectation. Societies, communities, and individuals are constantly being guided by forces unseen, shaping behavior without the consent or awareness of those affected. The infant, with teeth and presence that defied natural understanding, embodied this principle fully, demonstrating that power does not require force, only awareness, precision, and subtle orchestration. For you, the observer, this is where the descent becomes unavoidable. The patterns you see, the fear, the compliance, the invisible current shaping thought, exist not only in this historical anomaly, but everywhere around you. Recognition of these forces changes your perception forever. You begin to see the scaffolding beneath human society, the mechanisms by which control is silently maintained, and the fragile illusion of autonomy that most take for granted. By the 17th month, the first deliberate encounters between the infant and visiting observers took place. These were not casual visits. They were orchestrated tests by those who understood that anomalies could reveal the deepest mechanics of influence and control. Physicians, clerics, and town officials approached cautiously, armed with notebooks, instruments, and preconceived theories, yet none were prepared for the silent power radiating from the child. His teeth, sharp and glinting in candlelight, were both warning and marker. He existed outside conventional understanding, and he sensed awareness in others before they themselves recognized it. Each observer became an unintentional participant in a live experiment. The infant's gaze, unblinking and precise, measured expectation, intent, and fear. Conversations faltered mid-sentence, objects shifted subtly, drawing attention away from intended actions. Even the rhythm of the room, the timing of steps, flickering shadows, and ambient sound, was quietly orchestrated to provoke observe, and record reactions. Those who thought they controlled the interaction were, in fact, being controlled. Their biases, their authority, even their sense of rationality, were manipulated by presence alone. The parents watched these interactions with mounting unease. They realized their child had become more than an anomaly. He was a teacher of power, a living demonstration of how perception, anticipation, and fear could be calibrated to shape behavior. Visitors, confident in their social and scientific authority, were quietly guided into patterns of obedience, hesitation, and silent compliance. The teeth, the gaze, the aura of awareness, they acted as instruments, revealing how subtle influence could overpower conscious intent without confrontation or violence. Beyond the household, these experiments were already being recorded by the hidden networks of control. Observers documented everything, but only selectively, filtering data to preserve secrecy. The infant's interactions became a model of influence, showing how fear, anticipation, and psychological pressure could be measured, repeated, and applied systematically. This was the architecture of obedience in miniature, subtle, pervasive, and nearly impossible to detect without intimate awareness. For the observer, the lesson is clear and chilling. Real power rarely asserts itself overtly. It operates invisibly, shaping perception and behavior through presence, expectation, and the quiet orchestration of circumstance. The infant, through silent awareness and subtle tests, exposed the fragility of human control and revealed the hidden scaffolding of social influence. To witness this is to see how easily obedience can be cultivated, how effortlessly compliance can be engineered, and how deeply fear and anticipation shape human action without the subject ever realizing it. By the 18th month, it became clear that the infant's influence extended beyond individuals to entire social networks. Observers, initially confident in their authority and rationality, began to adjust behaviors unconsciously, spreading subtle ripples of anticipation, fear, and compliance. The teeth, sharp and reflective, were constant reminders that this was no ordinary child. His presence calibrated reactions, guiding behavior silently, shaping not only thought but the collective rhythm of those around him. Even casual encounters outside the household were affected. Merchants hesitated in transactions. Children avoided the vicinity of the home instinctively. Neighbors unconsciously deferred to unseen authority. Fear and expectation had become structural. The infant had become a nexus of influence, demonstrating that perception itself could be orchestrated, and that obedience could be elicited. Without overt instruction, each observer became both subject and instrument in a subtle, living experiment of control. Inside the household, the parents noticed how this networked influence reinforced itself. Actions, once independent, were now synchronized to the currents radiating from the child. Hesitation, caution, and compliance spread like a contagion, demonstrating how a single anomaly could reorganize patterns of behavior across multiple individuals. The infant, through presence alone, was teaching the mechanics of systemic influence, showing how invisible forces could shape not only decisions but social interactions themselves. External agents, connected to hidden networks of surveillance and control, meticulously documented the effects. They noted not just individual responses, but the ways in which behaviors propagated across groups. Patterns of obedience, anticipation, and social conformity were being recorded, forming the blueprint of influence, a pre-modern study in the architecture of psychological control. The infant's anomaly became a model, a demonstration of how perception and expectation could be subtly manipulated, yielding predictable patterns of behavior across networks without physical intervention. Here is the crucial understanding. Power does not require direct confrontation. It operates through observation, anticipation, and the quiet orchestration of perception. The infant's teeth, gaze, and silent awareness were instruments of influence, exposing the hidden mechanics by which social systems can be shaped and maintained. To observe this is to understand a dangerous truth. Obedience, fear, and compliance are often cultivated invisibly, silently, and with precision, long before the subject recognizes their own participation. For you, the observer, this is the threshold where comprehension deepens. What seems like ordinary social interaction is, in fact, a system shaped by invisible currents of influence. The anomaly, the child with teeth, awareness, and presence, reveals the scaffolding upon which human behavior, social order, and obedience are silently constructed. Recognition of this changes the way you perceive history, society, and your own interaction with unseen power. By the 19th month, the infant's awareness had entered a new phase. No longer merely reactive or anticipatory, he began to manipulate group dynamics consciously, guiding behavior and perception with subtle precision. Visitors and household members alike found themselves unconsciously aligning with his presence, making decisions they could not fully explain, obeying impulses they did not recognize. The teeth, now sharp and unmistakable, acted as symbols of authority and awareness, projecting a quiet command that shaped responses without a word. During gatherings, the infant's gaze would move deliberately, seemingly calculating reactions. A servant's hesitation, a guest's misstep, even the parent's unspoken intentions, all were measured, catalogued, and redirected. The household became a live experiment in influence, a microcosm of systemic control. Every subtle gesture, glance, or movement reinforced obedience and anticipation, demonstrating that power does not need violence to be effective. It requires only awareness, perception, and strategic subtlety. External observers, connected to hidden networks of control, took note. Their meticulous records documented not only the infant's presence but the propagation of influence through social groups. These tests, unintentional or orchestrated, revealed the mechanisms by which human behavior could be guided silently, how fear and expectation could be transmitted across networks, and how perception itself could be shaped without overt intervention. The child's anomaly had become a model for understanding social manipulation at its most fundamental level. Inside the home, the parents struggled with a new reality. They were no longer merely witnesses, they were participants, subjects in a system of influence that extended beyond their comprehension. Every choice, every hesitation, every emotional fluctuation was noted and responded to by the infant, silently teaching lessons in obedience, anticipation, and control. The teeth and gaze served as constant reminders. Influence could operate without command, and authority could exist entirely through presence and perception. For the observer, the lesson is profound. Power often functions invisibly, quietly shaping thought, behavior, and social interaction. The infant's presence demonstrates that obedience, compliance, and fear can be cultivated without physical intervention, weaponizing awareness itself. Once you recognize these patterns, you perceive the scaffolding beneath human behavior, social systems, and history itself, a hidden architecture of influence that operates beneath conscious recognition. By the 20th month, the cumulative effects of the infant's presence began to manifest in the household in ways that were undeniable and unsettling. The parents and servants, once confident in their autonomy, now operated under a constant, invisible pressure. Their thoughts, decisions, and even emotions subtly aligned with the currents radiating from the child. Hesitation became instinct, fear became anticipation, and obedience was internalized without the need for command. The teeth, sharp and reflective, acted as persistent symbols of the anomaly's authority, a reminder that presence alone could reshape cognition. The mother, in particular, noticed her perception shifting. She found herself anticipating the infant's influence before it manifested, altering actions and speech to avoid subtle disruptions. Her thoughts were no longer entirely her own. They bent under the silent orchestration of observation, as if the house and the anomaly within it were teaching lessons she had no choice but to learn. Even the father, rational and disciplined, found his judgment clouded by anticipation, adjusting decisions to accommodate forces he could neither see nor measure. Servants, too, experienced the subtle recalibration of behavior. Minor mistakes became amplified in importance, hesitation transformed into silent compliance, and fear became internalized. No words were necessary. The infant's gaze and presence conveyed authority that transcended traditional mechanisms of discipline. The household itself had become a microcosm of influence, a living laboratory demonstrating how power operates quietly, invisibly, and relentlessly. Outside the household, ripples continued to spread through the town. Social interactions, previously independent, began to follow patterns dictated by unperceived currents of fear and expectation. People altered routes, conversations faltered, and instincts guided behavior in alignment with forces they could not articulate. The hidden networks observing these events recognized the infant as a model of systemic control, a proof of concept for how subtle psychological influence could guide individuals and groups without coercion. For you, the observer, this stage reveals a chilling truth. Prolonged exposure to awareness and influence reshapes cognition and emotion. Compliance, fear, and anticipation are internalized, often without conscious realization. The teeth, the gaze, the silent presence of this infant are not mere curiosities. They are instruments demonstrating how subtle control accumulates over time, molding perception, thought, and behavior. Once you witness this, your understanding of influence, power, and human behavior is irrevocably changed. By the 21st month, the infant's influence began producing visible shifts in the town itself. Streets once bustling with life fell silent at odd hours. Children hesitated before stepping near familiar pathways. Neighbors altered routines instinctively, avoiding the household without fully understanding why. The teeth, sharp and gleaming, served as a silent symbol of the unseen power radiating from that small body. Fear, anticipation, and subtle compliance were no longer confined to the home. They had begun to ripple through the community, creating invisible currents that shaped collective behavior. The infant's presence, though silent, orchestrated these shifts with a precision that unsettled anyone attuned to subtle forces. Conversations stalled, markets adjusted, and public interactions became punctuated with hesitation. The anomaly acted as a catalyst, revealing that influence need not be spoken or imposed. It could be absorbed, internalized, and transmitted through networks of perception. The town itself became an extension of the household laboratory, an unintentional participant in a systemic demonstration of control. Inside the house, the family observed these changes with mounting apprehension. Every visitor, every neighbor, every casual passerby was now responding to the infant's silent orchestration. The parents recognized that their child's anomaly had transcended the private sphere and was now reshaping collective norms. Anticipation, fear, and compliance were internalized at a social level, demonstrating how a single focal point of influence could propagate through human networks, adjusting behavior in alignment with unspoken authority. External observers, those connected to hidden networks of control, documented these phenomena meticulously. They noted the propagation of influence, measuring hesitation, fear, and adjustment in group behavior. The infant had become both subject and teacher, demonstrating principles of systemic influence, social manipulation, and the orchestration of human perception that would later inform the practices of those who maintained control across centuries. For the viewer, the lesson is stark. Influence operates not only on individuals but across networks, silently shaping social patterns. The teeth, the gaze, the presence of this infant, these are not anomalies to be dismissed. They are proof that fear, anticipation, and obedience can be cultivated collectively, that social behavior can be subtly directed without overt command, and that the structures of human interaction are far more malleable than we dare admit. Recognition of this changes how one perceives history, society, and the invisible forces shaping both. By the 22nd month, the infant's influence had escalated to a level that directly affected the town's leadership. Officials, once confident in their authority, found themselves unconsciously adjusting decisions, aligning behaviors, and recalibrating expectations in response to forces they could not perceive. The teeth, sharp and reflective, had become a symbol not only of anomaly but of latent authority, a silent reminder that perception itself could be guided without a word or action. The child's gaze, precise and unyielding, now operated with deliberate intent. He observed, anticipated, and subtly manipulated the thoughts and emotions of those around him, turning hesitation into obedience and curiosity into caution. Every visit from an official became a test in control, a misstep here, a faltered question there, each quietly absorbed and redirected. The infant's presence reshaped strategy, recalibrated expectation, and demonstrated that influence does not require violence, only awareness and anticipation. Inside the household, the parents were acutely aware of the changing dynamics. They recognized that the anomaly was no longer passive. It was an active agent in systemic influence. Every minor action, from a servant's footstep to a whispered conversation, became part of a network of observation, measurement, and subtle correction. The teeth and gaze were instruments of psychological authority, revealing the fragility of human control in the presence of awareness that operated outside conventional understanding. External observers from hidden networks documented these developments with meticulous precision. They recorded responses, hesitation, and compliance, noting how the infant's presence could guide thought, behavior, and social dynamics without overt intervention. The anomaly had become a model for the orchestration of systemic obedience, showing how collective behavior could be influenced by subtle cues, anticipatory awareness, and silent authority. For the observer, this stage underscores a dangerous truth. Power rarely asserts itself openly. It operates through anticipation, perception, and subtle orchestration, shaping thought and behavior across individuals and networks. The infant's anomaly, teeth, gaze, and silent awareness, demonstrates that compliance, fear, and obedience can be cultivated invisibly, leaving those under influence unaware of their participation. Once recognized, these principles reveal the scaffolding beneath human interaction, social structures, and history itself, exposing the fragile mechanics of control that govern society without acknowledgement. By the 23rd month, the infant's influence had reached a point where the town's elite could no longer ignore it. Though they could not articulate why, a sense of unease permeated meetings, council chambers, and gatherings. The teeth, sharp and glinting, were whispered about with trepidation, and the unblinking gaze had become a symbol of power that defied explanation. Curiosity turned to fear, and fear became a tool for control, directed silently by the anomaly at the center of it all. The first overt confrontation occurred during a council meeting. Officials, emboldened by status yet unnerved by instinct, attempted to assert authority over the household. But even in the formal setting of their office, the infant's presence, though distant, radiated influence. Hesitation infected speech. Decisions wavered mid-sentence. Observers documented subtle body language shifts, unconscious compliance, recalibration of tone, even strategic avoidance, revealing that influence could extend across distance, time, and intention without physical presence. Within the household, the parents witnessed the unfolding with dread and fascination. The anomaly had become a silent commander, orchestrating responses, shaping expectation, and instilling obedience without a single word. Servants adjusted instinctively, neighbors hesitated unconsciously, and officials faltered despite their conscious efforts to assert control. The teeth and gaze were no longer curiosities, they were instruments of authority, demonstrating that perception itself could be manipulated to shape behavior, even among the most confident and educated. External networks monitoring the situation took meticulous note. Every faltered word, every hesitant gesture, every subtle realignment of thought was recorded as proof of the mechanics of influence. The infant had become a living case study in systemic control, illustrating that fear, anticipation, and perception could govern behavior more effectively than overt power, command, or violence. The anomaly served as both subject and teacher, revealing principles that had governed elites and institutions for centuries without acknowledgement. For the observer, this confrontation exposes the profound and unsettling truth. Influence does not need visible force to dominate. Power operates quietly, invisibly, and persistently through anticipation, observation, and subtle manipulation of perception. The infant, teeth, gaze, and silent authority, demonstrates how obedience and fear can be cultivated invisibly, even in the presence of conscious resistance. Recognition of this truth changes everything. History, social structures, and personal understanding of control are no longer illusions, they are mechanisms, and the anomaly at the center has revealed them fully. By the 24th month, the infant's influence had achieved a level of consolidation rarely seen outside legend. The household and town alike moved in synchrony with imperceptible cues emitted from the child's presence. Fear, anticipation, and compliance had become internalized across individuals and social networks. Streets were traversed with cautious hesitation, conversations were moderated by instinctive awareness, and decisions, even by the town's elite, were filtered through an unseen lens of anticipation calibrated by the anomaly. The teeth, sharp and unyielding, served as a constant reminder that natural law no longer governed the dynamics in play. Within the home, the parents and servants had become participants in a system of influence that had silently reprogrammed behavior. Every glance, every movement, every thought was subtly guided, shaping cognition without awareness. Hesitation, once occasional, was now habitual. Compliance was internalized. Fear had evolved into anticipation, anticipation into strategy, and strategy into obedience. The infant's gaze, precise and penetrating, orchestrated the flow of thought and decision with a mastery that surpassed anything conscious manipulation could achieve. Outside, the town moved almost imperceptibly in alignment with these currents. Community patterns had shifted, social interactions were subtly rerouted, and collective behavior conformed unconsciously to the invisible rules emanating from the household. Even those unaware of the anomaly's existence were participating in its influence. The child had become a nexus of systemic control, demonstrating that power can operate without command, coercion, or enforcement. Presence alone, measured, anticipatory, precise, was enough to shape society. Observers from hidden networks documented every nuance. They catalogued hesitation, alignment, and subtle compliance, noting the extraordinary ability of the infant to influence thought, behavior, and social cohesion without explicit action. This was not mere anomaly. It was a living demonstration of the architecture of obedience, a blueprint for understanding how fear, anticipation, and subtle cues govern collective behavior throughout history. For the observer, this stage makes clear a fundamental truth. Authority often functions invisibly. Control is achieved not through force, but through awareness, subtle orchestration, and the manipulation of perception. The teeth, the gaze, and the silent intelligence of this infant illuminate the hidden scaffolding of influence, revealing that what humans consider free action is often quietly guided. Once recognized, this understanding fractures assumptions, exposing the fragile mechanics that govern history, society, and behavior itself. By the 25th month, the infant's authority was undeniable. Though no official decree had been issued, no threat spoken, and no violence enacted, the town and household operated under his silent sway. Streets, markets, homes, and council chambers all moved in subtle deference to the presence of the anomaly. Children hesitated instinctively, merchants altered routines, and officials second-guessed their own judgments. The teeth, sharp and reflective, were a constant, unspoken symbol of authority. The gaze, unwavering and precise, had become the axis around which fear, anticipation, and obedience revolved. Within the household, the cumulative psychological transformation was complete. Parents, once autonomous, now instinctively deferred to cues they could not name. Servants acted in perfect alignment with the child's unspoken rhythm, their behavior guided by anticipation rather than instruction. Hesitation had become habitual, obedience automatic. Every action, thought, and reaction had been subtly restructured by prolonged exposure to the anomaly. The infant had become both teacher and architect, demonstrating that influence operates most effectively when it is invisible, internalized, and pervasive. Beyond the home, the town's social structures had shifted similarly. Meetings, marketplaces, and public interactions conformed to patterns that no one could articulate. Fear and respect were internalized. Compliance and anticipation propagated silently through social networks. The infant's presence had created an ecosystem of influence, a living demonstration of systemic control that extended far beyond his physical reach. The anomaly had become a fulcrum of authority, illustrating that power does not require enforcement when perception and expectation are meticulously calibrated. Observers from hidden networks documented these effects meticulously, noting how subtle cues, prolonged exposure, and silent anticipation shaped individual and collective behavior. The infant had become a paradigm for understanding systemic control, a demonstration of how fear, obedience, and compliance can be cultivated invisibly, often before the subject even recognizes participation. The teeth and gaze were not merely anomalous, they were instruments of influence, evidence of the hidden architecture that underlies human society. For the observer, the lesson is irreversible. Influence often surpasses visible authority. Fear, anticipation, and obedience can be cultivated without confrontation, coercion, or instruction. The anomaly, this infant with teeth, presence, and awareness beyond understanding, reveals the mechanics of control that underpin society. Once perceived, the hidden scaffolding of influence, manipulation, and silent obedience becomes unavoidable, reshaping the way you understand history, social systems, and your own participation in forces beyond recognition. By the 26th month, the story of the infant who grew teeth overnight reaches its inevitable conclusion, but not with closure, rather, with awakening. The anomaly has done more than disrupt a household or ripple through a town. It has revealed a universal truth. The architecture of control is subtle, pervasive, and invisible. Authority does not always command. Influence does not always speak. Obedience, fear, and anticipation are often cultivated quietly, internalized before the mind even realizes it is participating. The parents, servants, and town had all been reshaped. Their thoughts, decisions, and